I realized she had come back only after my absence had settled into silence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that begs for attention, but the silence that replaces hope when it finally gives up. I was 42 when I stopped waiting for my mother to call. I remember the day clearly because nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no goodbye, just a quiet understanding that if I didn't reach out, she never would. That was the day I became invisible to her without officially disappearing. I learned that love could leave without slamming a door behind it gently. For years afterward, people asked why I never talked about her. They assumed distance meant anger, but anger requires energy, and I had already spent mine surviving. My mother was always admired by strangers. She laughed easily, volunteered at church, remembered birthdays that weren't mine. Growing up, I learned early that affection was conditional and attention was a reward for good behavior. When I failed to meet her standards, she withdrew with practiced grace, teaching me that absence could be wielded like discipline. I grew skilled at shrinking myself, hoping smallness would make her stay longer than before now maybe. When I left home at 18, I promised myself I would not chase love that ran. I built a life carefully, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. I married young, divorced quietly, learned how to be alone without feeling empty. Through it all, my mother remained a distant figure, appearing occasionally with unsolicited advice and disappearing before responsibility arrived. She missed graduations, holidays, and the version of me that grew strong without her approval. I stopped checking my phone on birthdays because disappointment had become an expected guest who never knocked before entering my quiet celebrations alone at night. Still, then came the year I finally stopped hoping. Therapy helped, time helped more, and boundaries did the rest. I mourned the mother I never had while forgiving the woman she was. It felt like closure, like exhaling after holding my breath for decades. That was when she returned. Not with apologies, not with reflection, but with need. She called one evening as if no time had passed, her voice warm, familiar, and suddenly fragile. She said my name the way she used to when she wanted something and expected me to recognize it as love again without question or hesitation. I listened in silence as she explained her situation. She was lonely now. People had changed. Friends had moved. Life had become unfair, apparently without my involvement. She spoke of regrets vaguely, never naming them, never naming me. I realized then that she hadn't come back because she missed me. She came back because her audience had thinned. I was a familiar seat, always available, always forgiving, or so she believed. There was no curiosity about my life, only assumptions that I would pause it for her comfort like I had done my entire childhood faithfully without protest or reward. I told her I needed time. That was the first boundary she pretended not to hear. She began calling daily, leaving messages soaked in nostalgia and subtle guilt. She reminded me of sacrifices I didn't remember asking for. She spoke as if she had always been present, rewriting history with confidence. Each voicemail ended with the same line, said sweetly, dangerously, "I need you." Hearing it now felt different. It no longer sounded like love. It sounded like hunger. I finally understood that her need would always eclipse my existence entirely if I allowed it again like before so often. The turning point came quietly, as most truths do. She asked if she could stay with me for a while, just until she figured things out. The old reflex stirred, the one trained to accommodate, but it didn't take over. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Her return wasn't reconciliation, it was relocation. She wasn't running toward me. She was running from her own emptiness, dragging it toward my door. And suddenly, I felt protective of the life I had built without her because it was fragile, honest, and finally mine alone after years of waiting patiently. I told her no. Simply, clearly, without explanation. The silence afterward was sharp. Then came anger disguised as confusion, accusations wrapped in concern. She asked what had happened to me, as if growth were a betrayal. I listened, steady, unmoved. For the first time, I didn't try to soften the truth. I told her I was gone. Not physically, not cruelly, but emotionally finished chasing a version of love that never arrived. She wept, but the tears felt performative, familiar, and strangely distant. I did not move toward her pain this time because I finally recognized it as her responsibility. After that call, weeks passed. The quiet returned, but it felt different now. It was full, earned, and calm. I expected grief, but what came instead was relief. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I realized how much space her absence had given me to exist freely. Sometimes she sent messages, long ones, recounting memories I remembered differently. I didn't respond. Silence was no longer punishment. It was protection. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from my self-doubt and began trusting the version of me that chose peace deliberately over chaos, guilt, and habit-formed years. I don't know if she ever understood why I didn't come back when she called. Maybe she told herself a story where I was ungrateful or cruel. I'm fine with that. I didn't disappear to punish her. I left to save myself. Sometimes love returns only when it has nowhere else to go, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is remain gone, even when they finally knock. Because by then, you've learned your absence was never what hurt them most. It was the loss of control over someone they assumed would stay forever quietly and available without resistance. After I said no, I expected guilt to chase me, but it never did. Instead, something steadier arrived, something like ownership of my own time. I woke up each morning without bracing myself for disappointment. I stopped checking my phone with that tight feeling in my chest, the one that came from years of waiting for her mood to decide my worth. Friends noticed before I did. They said I sounded lighter, less apologetic, more present. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by anticipation of her reactions, even when she was absent. Letting go didn't feel like loss. It felt like stepping out of a shadow I had mistaken for shelter. Of course, silence doesn't erase memory. It rearranges it. Without her voice interrupting my thoughts, memories surfaced differently. I remembered how she praised me in public but corrected me in private, how love always came with instructions. I remembered learning to read rooms before reading books, learning to anticipate displeasure before understanding joy. Those habits stayed with me long after I left her house. They showed up in relationships, in jobs, in the way I apologized for taking up space. I had built competence on top of compliance, and it took years to notice the foundation was cracked. I started paying attention to the patterns I had normalized, how I explained myself too much, how I waited for permission that was never required, how I mistook endurance for loyalty. Therapy gave me language, but distance gave me clarity. I could finally see my mother not as a villain, but as a woman who outsourced her emptiness onto her child. Understanding that didn't excuse her choices, but it freed me from carrying explanations for them. Her pain was real, but it was not transferable. I returned it gently, without malice, by refusing to hold it anymore. Months passed. Her messages slowed, then sharpened. When nostalgia stopped working, she tried authority. When authority failed, she tried vulnerability. Each attempt felt like a test I no longer studied for. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I let the messages sit unanswered until they lost their urgency. Silence, I learned, is only cruel when used to control. When used to heal, it is a boundary with breath in it. I wasn't punishing her. I was practicing something new, something I should have learned earlier but was finally ready to apply. The strangest part was how ordinary my life became. No emotional spikes, no sudden collapses, just days that unfolded without drama. I cooked meals without rushing. I made plans without contingency guilt. I let friendships deepen without fear they would be taken away. It was in that calm that I noticed grief finally arriving. Late and honest, not grief for her absence, but for the version of myself that learned to survive instead of being cared for. I mourned quietly, privately, without needing an audience or permission. One afternoon, a mutual acquaintance mentioned my mother in passing. She had told people she was confused, hurt, abandoned. The story painted her as the one left behind. I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to correct the record, to defend my truth. but it faded quickly. I didn't need witnesses anymore. My healing didn't require consensus. I understood then that some people survive by rewriting the past, while others survive by releasing it. I chose release, even when it meant being misunderstood. What surprised me most was the absence of rage. I had expected anger to surface once the fear subsided, but it never did. What replaced it was discernment. I could feel the difference between missing someone and missing the idea of who they could have been. I missed the fantasy, not the reality, and fantasies, once named, lose their power. I stopped imagining conversations where she finally understood me. Understanding was not a prerequisite for my peace. Acceptance of that fact felt like a quiet victory. There were moments of doubt, usually late at night, when old training whispered that I was selfish, cold, ungrateful. I let those thoughts pass without argument. They were echoes, not truths. I learned that growth often feels like betrayal to those who benefited from your silence. That knowledge steadied me when guilt tried to return wearing familiar clothes. I reminded myself that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks you control. I don't know what my mother tells herself now. Maybe she believes I changed. Maybe she believes she did nothing wrong. Maybe she believes I'll come back eventually. None of that is mine to manage. I have stopped positioning my life as a waiting room for someone else's arrival. I am here now, fully, without apology. She came back when I was gone, and by then I had already learned how to stay. Staying did not mean freezing in place either. It meant choosing movement that honored my limits. I traveled, took classes, met people who listened without trying to edit me. I learned the pleasure of being believed without evidence, of being trusted with my own experience. When mistakes happened, I handled them without spiraling into shame. I discovered that safety could exist without surveillance, love could exist without conditions, and family, when chosen carefully, could be built from consistency rather than obligation. Each day added a layer of confidence that no one could revoke retroactively. I wasn't running from her anymore. I was walking toward myself, unhurried, finally convinced that arrival did not require her permission. I let the future remain undefined. I stopped rehearsing explanations for choices I had not made yet, the quiet held, steady and forgiving. In that space, I became someone who could be present without performing, someone who trusted continuity more than intensity, someone who knew that being gone was not absence, but arrival transformed. It was enough to know I had chosen myself, and that choice, once made, did not require repetition to remain true for the rest of my life. I used to think being gone meant cutting ties completely, erasing history, pretending nothing ever existed. But that wasn't what happened. Being gone was subtler than that. It was the decision to stop offering myself as an emotional resource to someone who never learned how to replenish what they took. I didn't delete her number at first. I just stopped answering. That distinction mattered to me. It meant I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. Choice changes the shape of everything. As the months passed, I noticed how often her voice still appeared in my head, even without contact. It showed up when I hesitated before speaking honestly, when I second-guessed joy, when I felt the urge to overachieve just to justify my existence. Her absence revealed how deeply she had been woven into my internal landscape. Undoing that took patience. I had to learn how to hear myself without filtering it through imagined approval or disappointment. It felt awkward at first, like speaking a language I once knew but hadn't practiced in years. I began to notice how others reacted to my boundaries. Some respected them immediately, some tested them gently, a few resisted outright. That taught me something important. People who benefit from your availability often mistake it for entitlement. When you remove access, they call it distance. When you remove explanation, they call it cruelty. I stopped correcting those interpretations. I didn't owe clarity to people who preferred confusion if it kept them comfortable. That lesson extended far beyond my mother. It reshaped every relationship I had. One evening, I found an old photo while cleaning out a drawer. It was of my mother and me, taken when I was small. She was smiling widely, her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. I studied the picture longer than I expected. It wasn't fake. The love in that moment was real. That's what made everything so complicated. She wasn't incapable of care. She was inconsistent with it. And inconsistency, I learned, can be more damaging than absence because it teaches you to chase what appears briefly, then vanishes without explanation. I sat with that realization for a long time. It helped me soften without reopening the door. I could acknowledge that she loved me in the only way she knew how without pretending that it was enough. Both truths could exist without cancelling each other out. I didn't need to villainize her to validate myself. I just needed to stop romanticizing what hurt me. Letting go of the fantasy felt like grief, but it also felt like relief. I was no longer negotiating with the past. Around that time, she sent one final message. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic. It said she hoped I was well and that she missed me. I read it once, then set my phone down. My body reacted before my mind did. There was no spike of panic, no rush of obligation, just a quiet sadness, clean and contained. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish her, but because responding would have reopened a dynamic I had already outgrown. Silence was not avoidance anymore. It was alignment. I began to understand that some relationships don't end with a confrontation, they end with a realization, a shift so internal that it doesn't require an audience. I had spent years waiting for her to see me clearly, to recognize what she had missed. But clarity doesn't always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it's something you grant yourself. That realization settled deeply, changing how I approached disappointment, forgiveness, and expectation. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a transaction. It doesn't require reconciliation. It doesn't require access. It doesn't even require the other person to know it happened. Forgiveness, for me, became the act of releasing the fantasy that she would ever be the mother I needed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with tears or declarations. It came quietly, like a decision made after careful thought. And once made, it stayed. As I moved forward, my life didn't suddenly become perfect. I still struggled. I still doubted. But the struggle was mine now, not inherited. I could fail without fearing abandonment. I could succeed without bracing for resentment. I learned how to let people support me without feeling indebted. That was new, that was hard, but it was also healing. The absence of her influence gave me room to practice healthier patterns, even when I got them wrong. Sometimes people ask if I'll ever reconnect with her. I tell them I don't know because the truth is, I don't need to know. My life is no longer on pause waiting for a reunion that may never come. If she returns again, it will be to a version of me who is no longer willing to disappear to make space. That version of me is gone. And in her place stands someone who understands that love is not proven by endurance, but by mutual presence. I don't regret leaving. I regret how long it took me to realize I was allowed to, but regret, like everything else, loses its grip when faced honestly. I was not wrong for wanting more. I was not cruel for stepping away. I was simply finished sacrificing myself to preserve a relationship that only existed when I was willing to be small. She came back when I was finally gone, and by then I had already learned that being gone was the beginning, not the end. There was a moment, sometime after the quiet settled, when I realized how much of my identity had been shaped around endurance. I had worn patience like a badge, mistaking it for strength. I believed that if I waited long enough, if I stayed kind enough, if I made myself useful enough, love would eventually stabilize. Walking away forced me to confront how deeply that belief had rooted itself in me. Without someone to wait for, I had to learn who I was when no one was withholding anything from me. I began noticing the subtler ways the past still echoed, how I felt uneasy when people were consistently kind, how I anticipated withdrawal after moments of closeness. I had learned early that affection came in waves and disappeared without warning, so stability felt suspicious. Being gone from my mother gave me the distance to see that pattern clearly. It also gave me the chance to interrupt it. Awareness didn't erase the instinct, but it softened it enough for me to respond differently. One of the hardest lessons was accepting that my mother's return wasn't about timing or fate. It wasn't some poetic realization on her part. It was circumstance. She came back when her options narrowed, when the world stopped responding to her the way it used to. That truth hurt less than I expected. In a strange way, it clarified everything. Her absence had never been personal. Her return wasn't either. Both were reflections of her needs, not my worth. Understanding that freed me from the urge to personalize abandonment. I stopped asking what I could have done differently. I stopped replaying moments, searching for mistakes. There was nothing to fix because I hadn't broken anything. I had simply grown beyond a role that no longer fit. Growth often looks like betrayal to those who relied on your stagnation. That doesn't make growth wrong. It makes it necessary. I also had to grieve the loss of imagined repair. There is a specific kind of sadness that comes from accepting that some relationships will never have a satisfying conclusion. No apology that lands cleanly, no conversation that ties everything together, just an ending that arrives quietly, without ceremony. I sat with that grief instead of rushing past it. I let myself feel the disappointment without turning it into blame. That process was slower than anger, but far more honest. As time went on, I noticed something else shifting. My compassion changed shape. It became less reactive, more intentional. I could acknowledge my mother's loneliness without feeling responsible for it. I could understand her fear of aging without offering myself as a solution. Compassion no longer required self-erasure. It could exist alongside boundaries. That distinction changed everything. It allowed me to feel human without feeling trapped. I started to trust my instincts again, the ones I had learned to doubt because they conflicted with her narrative. When something felt off, I listened. When something felt safe, I leaned in. That trust extended inward as well. I stopped questioning my right to rest. I stopped explaining my choices preemptively. I let decisions be simple, even when others found them confusing. Simplicity, I learned, is often mistaken for coldness by people who thrive on complexity they can manipulate. There were days when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A song, a scent, a phrase someone said that sounded like her. Those moments no longer pulled me backward. They passed through, leaving a quiet ache, but no urgency. I didn't need to chase the feeling or resolve it. I let it exist, then let it go. That, too, was new. I had spent so long either suppressing emotion or drowning in it. Learning to let feelings move without anchoring them felt like freedom. I also noticed how my sense of family began to shift. It became less about blood and more about behavior. The people I trusted showed up consistently. They listened without trying to fix me. They didn't disappear when I needed space. I built rituals with them, shared meals, long conversations, silence that didn't feel awkward. These connections didn't replace my mother. They simply proved that connection could look different, healthier, and more mutual. Sometimes I wondered if she noticed the change, if she sensed that the version of me she once knew was no longer available. Maybe that's why her attempts grew quieter instead of louder, or maybe she moved on to another source of validation. I'll never know, and I don't need to. Closure doesn't require answers, it requires acceptance. I accepted that she came back when I was gone, and that timing told me everything I needed to understand. Being gone didn't mean I hardened, it meant I clarified. I learned where I ended and others began. I learned that love offered late, without accountability, is not a gift. It's an invitation back into imbalance. Declining that invitation wasn't cruelty, it was self-respect, and self-respect, once practiced, becomes difficult to abandon. I don't tell this story with bitterness. I tell it with honesty, because there are people who will recognize themselves in the waiting, in the hoping, in the moment when someone returns only after you've rebuilt yourself without them. If there is one thing I know now, it's this: you are allowed to be gone. You are allowed to choose peace over proximity. And when someone comes back after you finally left, it doesn't mean you have to return. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stay where you are. There's a subtle power in absence, not in spite of others, but in service to yourself. When I finally stepped away, I discovered that space is not emptiness, it's a canvas. I began filling it intentionally. Mornings were no longer punctuated by anticipation of her messages, no longer shaded by anxiety over her silence. Instead, I woke with the luxury of routine shaped entirely by my own preferences: coffee in the sun, walks without expectation, books that had nothing to do with her world. That intentionality created a new rhythm, one where my life didn't pause for anyone else's choices. I also began noticing how absence clarified my values. When you are present for someone who shows inconsistency, your principles often bend to accommodate them. You convince yourself that patience is virtue, loyalty is unquestionable, and endurance is a measure of character. But absence magnifies truth. What I had tolerated for decades suddenly looked stark and unfiltered. Patterns of manipulation or neglect were easier to identify. The things I had minimized to her way now appeared for what they truly were, and recognizing them didn't make me cruel. It made me vigilant. One of the first changes I made was reclaiming my emotional bandwidth. I stopped over-explaining myself to people whose presence came sporadically. I stopped anticipating her moods. I stopped constructing my day around the likelihood of her contact. This wasn't coldness, it was practicality. My energy is finite. Allocating it wisely is not selfish, it's survival. People who return late often expect you to resume old roles seamlessly, but the truth is, by then, your life has already shifted. Returning to the past isn't possible without diminishing the present. I learned to welcome discomfort. For years, I had sought stability by avoiding conflict, suppressing anger, or pretending absence didn't hurt. Being gone forced me to confront every uncomfortable sensation: loneliness, frustration, ambivalence. And in sitting with those feelings, I realized something profound. Discomfort is not damage, it is signal. It tells you when something needs attention, when a boundary must be drawn, when self-respect has been compromised. Listening to it is not weakness. Ignoring it is the danger. Unexpectedly, absence also sharpened my intuition about relationships. I became more attuned to subtle cues, a pattern of excuses, a lingering defensiveness, a quiet withdrawal masked as concern. Those cues had always been there, but proximity dulled perception. Distance honed it, and with honed perception came choices. I could act, respond, or disengage, and I did, in ways that preserved my dignity. The truth is that absence doesn't just teach patience, it teaches discernment, and discernment is a quiet, unwavering power. I noticed how my self-image shifted. Without her constant commentary, her judgments, her implied criticisms, I began seeing myself in ways unmediated by her lens. Small victories became monumental: finishing a book, completing a project, maintaining a consistent morning routine. Moments that once seemed ordinary felt like evidence of growth. I realized that my sense of self had been fragmented by the demand to conform to her fluctuating standards. Freedom allowed coherence. There were moments of temptation. Old patterns whispered, "If she calls, answer. If she comes back, forgive. If she asks, accommodate." I resisted, not because I wanted to punish her, but because doing so would erode the foundation I had built in her absence. I had become someone who values reliability over apology, consistency over charm, presence over excuses. That standard had been mine to define. Allowing her back without these markers would have been regression, not reconciliation. I also began reconstructing my social network with intention. Friends who were previously peripheral gained importance. Shared experiences became anchors. Trust, once fragile, was rebuilt methodically. I noticed a subtle elegance in relationships built on reciprocity rather than obligation. I didn't need to prove my loyalty. I didn't need to earn affection through endurance. Mutuality became the new standard, and it changed the way I moved through the world. Engagement was deliberate, Withdrawal was protective, every interaction had purpose, and that clarity brought peace. Financial independence, previously a background concern, became symbolic of personal autonomy. Managing my resources wasn't about wealth, it was about freedom. Every dollar allocated intentionally reinforced the principle: your life is yours to steer. Dependence, I realized, can masquerade as intimacy. When she returned, I could afford to engage on terms that didn't compromise me. Absence had given me leverage not over her, but over my own life. That was a power unlike any other. I noticed how my creativity flourished. Uninterrupted time allowed projects to evolve organically. I wrote without needing validation. I sketched without judging. I explored ideas for no one but myself. Absence had given me permission to exist fully in my own narrative. There's a quiet joy in self-directed creation that doesn't rely on approval from someone whose presence was once conditional. It is both exhilarating and grounding. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that boundaries are not just rules, they are declarations of worth. When she returned, every word, every gesture, every request became a test of my boundaries. Saying no wasn't rejection, it was affirmation. Choosing solitude over old patterns wasn't loneliness, it was clarity. And in that clarity, I discovered a surprising paradox. The more firmly I respected myself, the more space there was for genuine connection. Not all of it involved her. In fact, much of it didn't. Yet it all contributed to a life that finally felt like mine. Absence also taught me to observe without attachment. I realized I had spent years reacting reflexively, responding to her moods, anticipating her needs, and adjusting my behavior to fit a narrative that wasn't mine. When she returned, I didn't feel the compulsion to react immediately. I watched, I listened, I allowed her words and actions to reveal their meaning gradually. There is a power in observation without attachment. It allows you to see reality clearly rather than the distorted version your emotions might insist upon. And clarity, as I discovered, is a shield. I began documenting my thoughts and emotions, something I had previously neglected. Writing them down removed the fog. Each entry was a conversation with myself, a way to clarify feelings that had once been clouded by expectation. Patterns became visible, recurring frustrations, silent resentments, and unacknowledged desires emerged. With documentation, I could track growth, notice regression, and make decisions based on insight rather than impulse. Absence had given me both the space and the discipline to cultivate this self-awareness. I also learned to embrace unpredictability. In her presence, I had sought consistency, even when it was illusory. I craved predictability because it felt safe, but stepping away shattered that illusion. Life doesn't adhere to schedules dictated by others. By leaning into unpredictability, I became adaptable, resilient, and less susceptible to disappointment. When she reappeared, her arrival was no longer disruptive. It was simply another variable in a life I had already learned to navigate independently. Forgiveness, surprisingly, became a practice of self-liberation rather than reconciliation. I discovered that forgiving her for past slights didn't mean condoning behavior. It didn't mean reopening doors that had been closed for good reason. Instead, forgiveness was a conscious release of the hold she had on my emotions. Letting go of resentment allowed me to engage with her, or not, without internal conflict. Forgiveness was not about her. It was about creating inner space for peace, clarity, and agency. I also re-evaluated attachment itself. The more I understood the patterns of my emotional investments, the more I realized how often I had surrendered autonomy for connection. Absence recalibrated that dynamic. I began forming attachments that were voluntary, conscious, and reciprocal. The return of someone from the past was no longer an automatic emotional trigger. It became a choice. I could engage fully or maintain distance, guided by rational consideration rather than compulsion. That shift was subtle but profound. It fundamentally changed my interactions with her and with the world. Her eventual reappearance was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost mundane, and that, too, was instructive. There was no need for grand gestures or elaborate apologies. She returned to a space that no longer revolved around her, a life that had moved forward without her presence. That reality was humbling for both of us. I had grown into someone who did not require validation from her return. My happiness, my achievements, my sense of worth, none of it depended on her. That independence was not arrogance, it was integrity. I noticed subtle shifts in the language I used with her. Politeness replaced urgency, engagement replaced desperation. Questions were framed as curiosity, not as tests of loyalty. Conversations had boundaries, unspoken yet mutually understood, and in these interactions, I realized something essential. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. Her return could not recreate the past, nor could it undo the growth I had cultivated. Our history existed, but it no longer dictated the present. That realization was liberating. I also observed the reactions of others to her return. Friends, acquaintances, even casual observers noted my composure, my independence, my lack of entanglement. Their reactions were not the objective, but they were affirming. It was proof that consistent self-respect resonates outwardly. People respond to the energy you carry, not merely the words you speak. My life had become a reflection of choices made deliberately in absence, and that reflection was visible to anyone who looked closely. I realized that time itself had become a tool. Previously, moments were fragmented by waiting, wondering, and responding. Absence gave me command over my hours, days, and weeks. Each segment of time became a resource, allocated deliberately to pursuits that nourished me. Her return did not diminish this command. If anything, it highlighted the contrast between a life dictated by her presence and a life structured around my autonomy. That contrast reinforced the wisdom of my earlier choices. Gradually, I found a new rhythm with her. Interaction was possible, but only on terms that respected the boundaries I had established. This did not mean warmth was absent, it simply meant it was intentional. Every exchange was measured, deliberate, and free from the compulsion to compensate for past neglect. In this rhythm, there was balance, connection without surrender, engagement without erosion, presence without obligation. It was a relationship redefined, not by desire alone, but by clarity and self-respect. I began to see that absence was not punishment, it was preparation. It prepared me to live fully, to discern wisely, and to engage without compromise. Her return became a catalyst, not a crisis. The lessons learned in solitude were not nullified by her presence, they were reinforced. I had become someone who could welcome connection while maintaining autonomy, someone who could listen without being ensnared, someone who could care without surrendering self-worth. This realization was both empowering and serene. Her return also forced me to confront lingering attachments I hadn't fully acknowledged. Even with all my growth, part of me had hoped for reconciliation, a restoration of what we once had. I realized that hope was not a failure, it was human, but it needed to be understood and managed. I examined it carefully, tracing it back to patterns of longing, nostalgia, and the comfort of familiarity. What I discovered was profound. It wasn't her presence I truly missed, but the version of myself that existed when she was around, a version that had depended too heavily on external validation. Understanding this distinction changed everything. I started differentiating between desire and necessity. Desire is a feeling, it can be intense, fleeting, or persistent, but necessity is rooted in survival, in core needs. I realized that much of my past attachment had been fueled by a false sense of necessity. Her attention had never been a requirement for my well-being, it had been a habit, a script I had repeated unconsciously. Recognizing this allowed me to engage with her from a place of choice rather than dependence. I could appreciate her presence without being controlled by it. I also noticed a shift in my emotional vocabulary. Previously, I described my feelings in extremes, longing or rejection, elation or despair. Absence introduced nuance. I began articulating subtler shades of emotion, curiosity, tempered interest, cautious optimism. These refined descriptors were not just linguistic, they were cognitive tools that reshaped my experience. By naming emotions with precision, I reduced the tendency to be overwhelmed by them. Her return became a situation to navigate with awareness rather than reactively, a mental exercise in balance and discernment. Physical space gained significance as well. In her presence, I had unconsciously ceded parts of my environment, my time, my energy, even my routines, to accommodate her whims or expectations. Absence allowed me to reclaim that territory. When she reappeared, I was clear about my boundaries, the ways she could participate in my life, the limits of influence she could exert, the pace at which engagement occurred. These boundaries were not rigid walls, but flexible frameworks that preserved my autonomy while permitting connection. I also began testing my own assumptions. I noticed that I had carried narratives about her motives, intentions, and feelings that were based more on my insecurities than on evidence. Observing her return objectively required questioning those assumptions. Was she genuinely seeking reconnection, or was it curiosity, guilt, or habit? Was my excitement a reflection of her value, or a projection of my own longing? By interrogating assumptions, I reduced the likelihood of manipulation, disappointment, or misinterpretation. The clarity that came from skepticism was profoundly stabilizing. Reflection on past mistakes became constructive rather than punitive. Previously, I would ruminate, replaying missteps with self-reproach. Absence allowed reflection to be analytical and solution-oriented. I could examine patterns without shame, identify behaviors that no longer served me, and commit to new approaches. Her return was not a test. It was an opportunity to observe whether I had truly internalized these lessons. I could act from consistency rather than reaction, from wisdom rather than residual attachment. I also explored gratitude in a new way. I realized that my growth, my autonomy, and my clarity were gifts of absence, not her presence. Gratitude shifted from being directed outward toward her to being directed inward toward myself. I appreciated my resilience, my self-discipline, and my capacity to evolve. This internalized gratitude fortified me, creating a foundation that external events could not easily shake. Her return was contextualized within that foundation, not as a source of validation, but as a variable within a stable structure. Communication evolved dramatically. Where before I had relied on implication, expectation, or emotional signaling, I now prioritized explicit clarity. I articulated needs, boundaries, and observations without blame or defensiveness. When she spoke, I listened with full attention but without preemptive judgment. This form of engagement reduced friction, increased mutual understanding, and prevented old patterns from resurfacing. Our dialogue became functional, respectful, and surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the turbulence of prior encounters. I also noticed how absence had changed my internal standards for connection. Previously, emotional engagement with her had often meant compromise or sacrifice. Now, engagement required alignment with my values and priorities. I could discern between connection that enriched my life and connection that drained it. Her return no longer automatically merited an emotional investment. It had to meet the criteria I had defined for meaningful interaction. This approach was not cold, it was strategic, ethical, and protective of both parties' integrity. Absence had also taught me to embrace ambiguity. Before, I had demanded certainty, clear signs of affection, explicit assurances, and predictable patterns. Her return, however, arrived without guarantees, and I discovered that comfort with uncertainty is a skill, not a flaw. I allowed myself to inhabit the grey space between curiosity and caution, engagement, and detachment. In that space, I could observe without immediate judgment, respond without reflexive emotion, and experiment with the boundaries of interaction without overcommitting. The uncertainty was no longer a threat, but a field for growth and discernment. I also noticed how absence refined my perception of value. I had once conflated attention with significance, believing that presence alone indicated worthiness. When she was gone, I realized that true value is measured by consistency, respect, and contribution, not by sporadic appearance or reactive gestures. Her return forced me to reassess. What does she offer now? Is her presence enhancing life, or merely filling an emotional gap I had once created for her? This reframing protected me from old cycles of disappointment and guided my responses with clarity. Empathy became more strategic. Previously, I had conflated empathy with indulgence, feeling compelled to accommodate her moods or absorb her emotional turbulence. Now, empathy was a conscious choice, deployed where appropriate but bounded by self-respect. I could understand her motivations, acknowledge her struggles, and respond with compassion without sacrificing my equilibrium. This refined empathy created a new form of connection, one that was mature, intentional, and balanced rather than reactive. I also reflected on my identity in absence. I had previously defined myself partly through her perception. Her approval, attention, or admiration had subtly shaped my self-image. Being apart allowed me to reclaim identity from external influence. I reaffirmed interests, routines, and ambitions that were independent of her presence. Her return was no longer a mirror of my self-worth. I had internalized validation, and any interaction with her existed as a choice rather than a necessity. This shift from external to internal grounding was liberating, transforming the emotional landscape entirely. I explored the concept of narrative closure. Our past had left loose threads, unresolved arguments, unspoken feelings, and lingering what-ifs. Her absence gave me the space to process and conclude these threads internally, without demanding external reconciliation. Closure became self-generated rather than externally imposed, allowing interactions upon her return to begin from a place of neutrality rather than historical baggage. I discovered that closure is not about erasing the past. It is about integrating it, acknowledging lessons, and freeing energy for the present. Timing and rhythm became more apparent. In prior interactions, I often rushed conversations or misaligned energy, responding in haste or expectation. Absence created an intuitive sense of pacing, when to listen, when to speak, and when to allow silence to communicate more than words ever could. Her return highlighted the importance of rhythm in dialogue and relationship dynamics. By respecting timing, I reduced conflict, enhanced understanding, and maintained an even emotional keel. I also recognized the subtle dynamics of influence. Previously, I had unconsciously allowed her moods and behaviors to shape my day, decisions, and self-perception. Distance revealed this pattern clearly. Upon her return, I could maintain influence over my internal state while acknowledging her presence. Influence became mutual rather than one-sided. I could respond with intention rather than reflex, participate without surrender, and engage without losing autonomy. This balance was not about control. It was about coexistence on terms of equality and respect. The notion of accountability shifted as well. I realized that while I was accountable for my actions, I was not responsible for her feelings or choices. Previously, I had overassumed responsibility, often internalizing guilt for things beyond my control. Absence clarified the boundary. I could act ethically and with integrity, but her emotions were hers to manage. Her return was no longer a test of my moral compass, but an opportunity to engage responsibly while maintaining personal clarity. I also observed the role of curiosity in engagement. Curiosity became a tool for exploration rather than judgment. I could inquire about her life, motivations, and perspectives without assuming obligations or expecting outcomes. Questions became gentle instruments for understanding, fostering dialogue and insight without entangling me in old emotional patterns. Curiosity replaced compulsion, creating a space where interaction was driven by interest rather than need. I began to appreciate subtle gestures and signals differently. In the past, I had misread attention or affection, interpreting minor actions as major validation or rejection. Absence honed my discernment. I could observe cues with measured interpretation, separating intent from projection. Her return required careful attention to these nuances, allowing me to respond appropriately without overreaction. Each interaction became a data point for understanding, not an emotional trigger demanding immediate response. I also reflected on legacy and continuity. What kind of relationship did I want moving forward, regardless of her presence? Absence had shown me the importance of preserving emotional integrity, building interactions that aligned with my long-term goals rather than short-term gratifications. Her return was evaluated against this framework. Does this interaction sustain growth, respect autonomy, and foster clarity, or does it revert to old, unhelpful patterns? This lens ensured decisions were proactive, not reactive. Finally, I considered the transformative power of absence itself. It was not merely a void, it was a crucible for self-discovery, reflection, and emotional recalibration. Her return highlighted this. The lessons I learned in her absence shaped every interaction, every response, and every boundary. I had emerged not just unscathed, but enhanced, more self-aware, more discerning, and more capable of experiencing connection without compromise. Her return, after all the distance and reflection, felt almost surreal. It wasn't the dramatic cinematic moment I might have imagined in the past. There were no fireworks, no sweeping declarations, just the quiet recognition of presence. And yet, in that simplicity, there was depth. Absence had stretched time, magnified subtle signals, and revealed the contours of who I had become. I noticed how the small things, like the tone of her voice, the pace of her gestures, the choice of words, held far more weight than the grand gestures that had once dominated our interactions. Every nuance was now a meaningful data point, a story within itself, revealing intention, vulnerability, or perhaps even manipulation. I reflected on how my expectations had shifted. Previously, I had approached reunions with longing, hope, and a mix of anxiety. There had always been a desire to recapture what was lost, to mend the fracture by sheer force of attention. Now, expectation had transformed into observation and curiosity. I no longer sought validation from her return. I sought understanding of her choices and clarity of her intentions. This subtle shift created a profound sense of liberation. Connection became a conscious choice rather than a desperate pursuit. I was no longer tethered to outcomes or consumed by what could be. Instead, I was anchored in reality, receptive but grounded. I also noticed the interplay between memory and presence. Memories of her past actions, her laughter, her frustrations, and her quirks had once clouded my perception, blending nostalgia with longing. Absence had sharpened the distinction between memory and current reality. Her return was a test not of what we had been, but of what we could be now. Each interaction demanded conscious engagement, free from the distortion of selective recollection. I could appreciate past moments without letting them dictate my present judgment, allowing authenticity to replace sentimentality. In this period, I had developed a more nuanced understanding of forgiveness, not as an erasure of wrongs, but as a deliberate release of emotional weight. Forgiving her, I realized, was less about her and more about my freedom. Absence had created the emotional space to forgive without needing acknowledgement or contrition from her. Her return did not obligate me to reconcile instantly. Instead, it allowed me to observe, interact, and choose how much energy I invested in renewed connection. Forgiveness became a tool for clarity, not a mechanism for compliance or emotional surrender. Boundaries emerged as the cornerstone of sustainable interaction. Before, boundaries had been fluid, often violated or misunderstood. Absence highlighted the necessity of clear lines, what was acceptable, what was not, and what required negotiation. Her return tested these boundaries subtly, in tone, in timing, in requests, in expectations. But I met each moment with a quiet firmness born of self-respect. I could allow closeness while maintaining personal autonomy, permit affection while ensuring it did not overshadow my emotional equilibrium. Boundaries were not walls, they were guardrails, protecting against derailment while still permitting movement and connection. I also reflected on the nature of influence and reciprocity. Previously, her presence had often pulled me into emotional cycles that left me drained or reactive. Distance had illuminated the pattern. Influence is healthiest when mutual and respectful, not unbalanced or coercive. Her return required mindful calibration, contributing where it fostered growth and connection, stepping back where engagement risked reactivating old habits. Interactions became iterative experiments in emotional intelligence, balancing empathy with self-preservation, generosity with discretion, and connection with discernment. Curiosity continued to play a central role. Every interaction became an opportunity to learn, not just about her, but about myself. Observing her choices, responses, and behavior illuminated my own values, priorities, and limits. I noticed triggers I had overlooked, blind spots in my empathy, and areas where patience or discernment were still evolving. Her return was a mirror, reflecting the distance I had traveled and the lessons I had internalized. It showed not just who she was, but how far I had grown and how much more intentional I could be moving forward. The concept of time felt different now. Absence had slowed perception, highlighting moments that were once taken for granted. Her return emphasized this change. Conversations stretched meaningfully, pauses became informative, and each interaction carried weight without needing dramatization. Time was no longer a pressure point, it was a lens for observation, allowing the evolution of understanding and emotional calibration. I could respond at my own pace, measure engagement thoughtfully, and savor subtleties rather than rush toward resolution or gratification. I also realized that resilience had become a quiet strength. The pain of separation, the uncertainty, and the loneliness had all contributed to building a capacity to endure emotional complexity without collapse. Her return tested this resilience subtly. Old insecurities whispered for attention, doubt tried to creep back, and the temptation to seek immediate validation lingered. But I approached each interaction with steadiness, acknowledging the past without surrendering to it, welcoming presence without dependency, and maintaining calm observation without reactivity. Resilience, I saw, was not just surviving absence, but thriving within it and beyond it. Finally, I reflected on the paradoxical beauty of her timing. She returned only when I had fully disengaged from expectation, only when my life had expanded, and only when my identity had solidified independent of her influence. It was as if the universe, or perhaps the natural rhythm of human connection, waited until I could engage without need, without compromise of integrity, and with full awareness of self. Her presence was no longer a test of attachment. It was an invitation to participate in a relationship built on choice, clarity, and mutual respect. And so I engaged, not out of longing, not out of fear, but out of conscious intention. Each word, gesture, and interaction was measured, thoughtful, and present. I listened deeply, spoke authentically, and responded without automaticity. I was neither defensive nor desperate. I was curious, discerning, and intentionally connected. The lessons of absence, clarity, patience, self-respect, empathy, and curiosity became the foundation for every moment we shared. I realized that her return was not about reclaiming the past, but about participating fully in the present, informed by experience and bounded by wisdom. In the end, absence had taught me that connection is not about possession, not about validation, and not about recreating history. It is about presence, clarity, and intentionality. Her return was a reflection of timing, not control, of curiosity, not compulsion, of choice, not dependency. I had arrived at a place where I could engage fully without losing myself, observe without overreacting, and love without needing to rescue or be rescued. It was not perfection, but it was conscious, intentional, and deeply human, a culmination of growth shaped by distance and refined by experience. And in that space, I finally understood. Sometimes, people return not because the timing suits them, but because absence has prepared you to meet them, not as you once were, but as you have become. Presence and absence are partners in growth, and only through the cycles of leaving and returning can we truly understand the depth of connection, the value of boundaries, and the power of self-discovery. I had left the old patterns behind, and her return became not a trap or a test, but an opportunity to engage with clarity, maturity, and choice, a final proof of how absence can transform both the heart and the mind.